What if the most dangerous man in ancient Athens wasn't a general with legions at his command, nor a fierce warrior brandishing bronze and fury? What if he was an old, often barefoot philosopher, armed with nothing but questions? This is the enigma of Socrates, a man whose intellect became a weapon more feared than any spear, whose inquiries threatened to unravel the very fabric of his society. This relentless public examination of life and belief was his divine mission, as he saw it, a service to the god Apollo. He was Athens' gadfly, stinging the great horse of state into awareness, preventing it from becoming sluggish and complacent. But a gadfly, while necessary, is also an irritant, and the powerful often prefer comfortable slumber to the sharp sting of truth. His mission was inherently confrontational. The core of Socrates' unnerving power lay in his method, the elenchus, often translated as refutation or cross-examination. It was a deceptively simple process. He would typically begin by asking for a definition of a concept, say, "What is justice?" or "What is courage?" from someone who professed to be an expert or hold strong opinions on the matter. This was the bait. Once a definition was offered, Socrates would proceed with a series of seemingly innocent questions, exploring the implications of that definition, testing it against various scenarios and commonly held beliefs. He would expertly guide the conversation, drawing out contradictions and inconsistencies within his interlocutor's own statements. The goal wasn't to win an argument, but to expose flawed understanding. The effect on his conversation partners was often profound. Confidence would erode, replaced by confusion, then frustration, and sometimes anger. Men who were respected leaders, acclaimed poets, or skilled craftsmen found their supposed wisdom crumbling under Socrates' gentle but persistent probing. It was a public undressing of their intellectual pretensions, a shattering experience for the ego. The Socratic method aimed at a state of aporia, a state of perplexity, of recognizing one's own ignorance. For Socrates, this was not an end point but a crucial beginning. Only by acknowledging what one does not know can the true search for knowledge and wisdom begin. But for many, particularly those in positions of power, admitting ignorance was tantamount to admitting weakness, a dangerous concession. Consider his dialogues with Euthyphro on piety, or Laches on courage. Euthyphro, so certain of his understanding of holiness that he was prosecuting his own father, was led to admit he couldn't define piety adequately. Laches, a respected general, found his definitions of courage falling apart under scrutiny. These weren't abstract games. They challenged the very basis of moral action and societal judgment. This method was particularly threatening because it was accessible. Socrates used simple language, everyday examples. He didn't rely on obscure texts or complex rhetoric. This meant anyone could, in theory, learn to question, to dissect arguments, to challenge authority. The youth of Athens, especially, were drawn to this, witnessing the intellectual takedowns of their elders. This was seen as utterly subversive. The Socratic method is not about providing answers, but about refining questions. It is a process of intellectual midwifery, as Socrates himself described it, helping others give birth to their own ideas, to clarify their own thoughts. But this process often involved the painful realization that previously held beliefs were ill-conceived or baseless. Truth, in this context, could be a harsh midwife. Imagine the scene. A powerful politician, accustomed to swaying crowds with rhetoric, suddenly finds himself unable to defend his core beliefs under Socratic cross-examination. His authority, built on perceived wisdom, visibly diminishes. This public dismantling of intellectual authority was a direct challenge to the social and political hierarchy of Athens. It was an attack on the foundations of power. This exposure of ignorance wasn't limited to the intellectual elite. Socrates questioned artisans about their crafts, poets about their inspiration, trying to understand the nature of their knowledge. He often found that they, too, could not articulate the foundational principles of their own expertise, relying instead on knack or tradition. This implied a lack of true understanding even in practical matters. His battlefield was the human mind. His conquests were the unmasking of ignorance, often in those who believed themselves wisest. He didn't seek to overthrow the state with force, but his relentless questioning shook the very foundations of Athenian society, challenging its most cherished beliefs and the authority of its most prominent citizens. What was it about his method that made him so utterly disruptive, so deeply unsettling to the powerful? The elenchus, therefore, was not merely a tool for philosophical clarification. It was a social and political force. By demonstrating that even the most respected members of society often operated on unexamined assumptions and contradictory beliefs, Socrates implicitly questioned the very legitimacy of their authority. He was teaching people how to think, not what to think, and that was dangerous. The targets of Socrates' relentless questioning were often those who held significant influence in Athenian society: politicians, orators, poets, and self-proclaimed teachers of wisdom. These were individuals whose reputations, and often their livelihoods, depended on their perceived knowledge and moral authority. Socrates' inquiries put these very assets at risk. Politicians like Anytus, one of Socrates' main accusers, were frequent subjects. These men claimed to understand what was best for the city, what constituted justice and good governance. Socrates would methodically deconstruct their assertions, revealing that their political platforms often rested on shaky, unexamined foundations or self-interest, rather than genuine wisdom. This was not a way to make powerful friends. The poets, revered in Greek society as sources of wisdom and moral guidance, were also scrutinized. Socrates questioned whether their beautiful verses stemmed from true knowledge or merely divine inspiration, of which they themselves had no rational account. When they couldn't explain the deeper meanings of their own works, it undermined their status as teachers of virtue. This was seen as an attack on culture itself. Even the skilled craftsmen, whom Socrates admired for their practical knowledge, were not spared. While they knew how to make things, they often couldn't articulate the underlying principles of their craft or define the broader virtues related to their work, like beauty or utility, in a consistent manner. This suggested that even practical know-how could be divorced from deeper philosophical understanding. By targeting these pillars of society, Socrates wasn't just having abstract philosophical discussions. He was actively, and very publicly, demonstrating that the emperor often had no clothes. This erosion of confidence in established authorities, in the very people who shaped public opinion and policy, was profoundly destabilizing. It created a vacuum, a space for new, potentially radical ideas to take root. The impact of Socrates' activities on Athens was multifaceted. On one hand, he stimulated intellectual fervor and critical thinking, particularly among the young. Figures like Plato and Xenophon, who would become foundational thinkers themselves, were deeply influenced by him. He was fostering a new generation of inquiring minds, a vital asset for any society. However, this corruption of the youth, as his accusers termed it, was precisely what terrified the conservative elements of Athenian society. They saw young men questioning traditional values, doubting the wisdom of their elders, and disrespecting established religious and political norms. This was not seen as healthy skepticism, but as the unraveling of social cohesion, a dangerous path. Socrates' constant questioning of terms like justice, virtue, and piety, the very bedrock of Athenian law and morality, created uncertainty. If no one could definitively say what these things were, then on what basis could laws be enforced, judgments made, or society governed? This intellectual ambiguity was seen as a threat to the stability of the polis itself. Furthermore, Athens had recently endured tumultuous times: the Peloponnesian War, plague, and periods of oligarchic rule. There was a strong desire for stability and a return to traditional certainties. Socrates, with his disruptive questioning, seemed to be undermining this fragile recovery, stirring up dissent when unity was deemed paramount. He was, in a sense, bad timing personified. The fear he instilled wasn't of physical harm, but of something far more profound: the exposure of intellectual vulnerability, the crumbling of unquestioned dogmas. This fear rippled through the city, reaching the ears of the powerful, who saw in his corruption of the youth a threat more insidious than any invading army. How could mere words, simple questions, begin to topple an empire of thought, an established way of life? The analogy of Socrates as a gadfly, which he himself used during his trial, is apt. He believed he was a divine gift to Athens, rousing it from complacency. While a gadfly's sting is annoying, it can also prevent a noble horse from becoming lazy and unresponsive. But the horse, in this case the Athenian state and its powerful figures, felt the sting more than the supposed benefit. Unlike a military enemy who attacks from without, Socrates' challenge emerged from within. He was an Athenian, a familiar, albeit eccentric presence. This made his critique more insidious and harder to dismiss. An external foe unites a city. An internal critic, especially one with compelling logic, can divide it by exposing its internal contradictions. This was his unique danger. The fear was not just that Socrates was wrong, but that he might be right. If his deconstructions of conventional wisdom held true, it implied that Athenian society was built on a foundation of ignorance and pretense. This was an intolerable thought for those invested in the status quo, for those whose power and prestige were tied to that very system. His influence, though not overtly political in terms of seeking office, was profoundly political in its consequences. By teaching critical thinking, he was empowering individuals to question authority, to demand rational justification for laws and policies. This is the essence of democratic accountability, but for some, it was a slippery slope towards anarchy or the rule of the unqualified. It was a fear of true intellectual democracy. The power of a warrior is finite. It lasts as long as his strength, his army, his weapons. But the power of an idea, once unleashed, can be limitless. It can transcend generations, cross borders, and inspire revolutions long after its originator is gone. The Athenian authorities perhaps sensed, even if dimly, that Socrates was planting seeds that could grow into something far beyond their control. This was the unseen threat. Thus, the discomfort Socrates generated was not merely intellectual, it was existential. He forced Athens to look into a mirror and confront its own intellectual and moral imperfections. For a city that prided itself on wisdom and democracy, this reflection was deeply unsettling, potentially shameful. And for some, it was an offense that could not be tolerated. Ultimately, the fear and resentment culminated in formal charges. Impiety, not believing in the city's gods and introducing new divinities, and corrupting the youth. These accusations, brought forward by Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, were broad enough to encompass the general anxieties Socrates provoked. They were the legalistic manifestation of a deeper societal unease. The charge of impiety was particularly potent. Religion was deeply interwoven with the state in ancient Athens. Questioning the gods, or suggesting alternative divine influences like his demon, could be interpreted as undermining the divine favor upon which the city's prosperity and security were believed to depend. This was treason of a spiritual kind. As for corrupting the youth, this charge stemmed directly from the sight of young, impressionable Athenians emulating Socrates' questioning style, sometimes mockingly, challenging their elders. The accusers framed this as teaching disrespect and disobedience, eroding the traditional hierarchical structures of family and society. It was a breakdown of order. Socrates' defense, as recorded in Plato's Apology, was not a plea for mercy but a steadfast reaffirmation of his philosophical mission. He argued that he was a benefit to Athens, not a threat. He famously refused to propose a punishment that would compromise his principles, such as exile, instead suggesting he be rewarded for his services. This defiance did not endear him to the jury. Warriors conquer lands, but Socrates conquered minds. His weapon, the elenchus, A relentless, drilling inquiry left even the most confident orators and politicians speechless, their arguments dismantled, their ignorance laid bare for all to see. This wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was a public unraveling that threatened the established order. What exactly did this Socratic method entail, and why was its application so devastatingly effective against entrenched belief? The political context of the trial is crucial. Athens was still recovering from its defeat in the Peloponnesian War and the brief, brutal reign of the 30 tyrants, some of whom, like Critias, had been associated with Socrates. Although Socrates himself was not an oligarch, these associations, however tenuous, likely fueled suspicion and a desire to purge perceived anti-democratic influences. He became a scapegoat. The jury, composed of 501 Athenian citizens, ultimately found him guilty by a relatively narrow margin. When it came to sentencing, his refusal to beg or propose a substantial alternative punishment, and his almost provocative suggestion of being maintained at public expense, likely sealed his fate. He chose death over a life without free inquiry. He chose martyrdom for his cause. His accusers likely did not expect or even desire the death penalty. They probably hoped Socrates would choose exile, removing his troublesome presence from Athens. But Socrates, committed to his principles and the laws of Athens, even when they condemned him unjustly, refused this path. His adherence to principle, even unto death, was his final lesson. The trial of Socrates is often seen as a stain on Athenian democracy, a moment where the city failed its own ideals of free speech and philosophical exploration. It demonstrates the fragility of even the most enlightened societies when confronted with ideas that fundamentally challenge their self-perception and power structures. The fear of the unknown is potent. What truly frightened his opponents was not just his questions, but the unwavering, almost divine, confidence with which he pursued his mission, even in the face of death. This suggested a conviction rooted in something deeper than mere opinion, a connection to truth that made him impervious to worldly threats. This was a different kind of power, an unyielding spiritual strength. The fear Socrates instilled was the fear of having one's comfortable illusions shattered, one's authority exposed as hollow, one's entire worldview questioned. For individuals and societies built on unexamined beliefs, this is a terrifying prospect, far more unsettling than a physical enemy whose threat is at least tangible and understandable. The intellectual warrior attacks the mind, the seat of identity. So why was Socrates, the philosopher, feared more than any warrior? A warrior threatens physical existence, aiming to conquer territory or destroy armies. Their impact, however devastating, is often confined to the material realm and a specific time frame. They fight with swords and spears, their victories marked by visible destruction or subjugation. Their threat is immediate and physical. Socrates, however, wielded a different kind of weapon: critical reason, relentless inquiry. He didn't seek to conquer lands but to liberate minds from the shackles of ignorance and dogma. His battlefield was the public square. His victims were unchallenged assumptions and pretentious claims to wisdom. This was an assault on the intellectual and moral foundations of society. The fear of a warrior can be countered with greater force, with stronger defenses, with strategic alliances. But how does one defend against an idea that takes root in the minds of the populace, especially the young? How does a state combat a method of thinking that empowers every individual to become a critic of authority? This threat is insidious, pervasive, and self-replicating. A warrior's victory might change a border or a ruler, but Socrates threatened to change how people thought, how they understood virtue, justice, and their place in the cosmos. Such a change is far more fundamental, far more lasting. It can reshape an entire culture from within, a transformation far deeper than any military conquest could achieve. Ideas, once accepted, become the new reality. This was no mere academic debate. The fear Socrates generated, the animosity he accrued, ultimately led to his trial and execution. Why would a city, renowned for its democracy and philosophical inquiry, condemned one of its most famous thinkers to death. What was the ultimate truth he was accused of unsettling? A truth so sacrosanct that its questioning was deemed a capital crime. The answer reveals a timeless struggle between entrenched power and uncomfortable, revolutionary truths. The powerful understood, perhaps instinctively, that while armies could be defeated or bribed, the Socratic spirit of inquiry, once ignited, was nearly impossible to extinguish. It posed a permanent challenge to unaccountable power and unearned authority. This is why the barefoot philosopher, armed only with questions, was ultimately deemed a greater, more fundamental threat than any soldier. His war was for the soul of Athens. Though condemned and executed, Socrates' death was not the end of his influence. In many ways, it was a new beginning. His martyrdom amplified his message, and his student Plato ensured that his philosophical method and inquiries would resonate through millennia. The fear he inspired in some became the inspiration for countless others. The Socratic method remains a cornerstone of Western critical thought, employed in education, law, science, and personal development. The courage to question, to seek definitions, to expose contradictions, and to admit ignorance. These are the enduring legacies of the philosopher who was feared for simply asking why. His questions echo still. Socrates demonstrated that true power does not always reside in physical might or political office, but in the courage to pursue truth and intellectual honesty, even at great personal cost. He showed that one individual, armed with nothing but a keen mind and a commitment to ethical inquiry, can challenge empires of thought and inspire profound societal transformation. This is a timeless lesson. The fear Socrates provoked highlights a perennial tension, the struggle between the comfort of unquestioned belief and the often uncomfortable, unsettling demands of critical self-examination. Societies, like individuals, must choose whether to embrace the gadfly's sting as a catalyst for growth or to silence it in favor of a more convenient, but ultimately stagnant, consensus. The choice defines their character. In our own age, saturated with information yet often starved of wisdom, the Socratic imperative to know thyself and to critically examine the world around us remains more relevant than ever. His story compels us to ask, which ideas, which unquestioned norms in our own time, might be the fragile constructs that a modern Socrates would gently, or not so gently, dismantle? And would we fear that process or welcome it? Socrates himself was an unconventional figure. He wrote nothing, preferring live dialogue. Often unkempt, wandering barefoot through the marketplace, he was a stark contrast to the polished sophists who charged hefty fees for their teachings. He claimed to know nothing, yet this very admission of ignorance became the starting point of a profound philosophical journey for himself and those he engaged. This humility was, paradoxically, a source of his intellectual strength. He was not a recluse. Socrates was a man of the city, a soldier who had fought bravely for Athens, a citizen who participated in its civic life, at least until his philosophical mission consumed him. This made his later critiques even more poignant. They came from someone who knew Athens, who understood its glories and its flaws from the inside. His loyalty was not to unquestioning obedience, but to a higher ideal of truth and justice. His demon, an inner divine voice, guided him, warning him against certain actions but never compelling him towards others. This inner compass, this reliance on personal spiritual guidance rather than solely on external societal norms or religious dogma, was another aspect that set him apart and for some, made him suspect. It hinted at an authority beyond the state, an individual connection to the divine that was unsettling. Unlike the sophists who claimed to teach virtue for a fee, Socrates engaged in dialogue freely, questioning anyone who would speak with him, from statesmen to artisans. He sought not to impose his own views, for he claimed to have none to teach, but to help others critically examine their own beliefs and arrive at their own understanding of concepts like justice, beauty, and goodness. This was a radical departure from traditional education.